Hey, everybody. So what we are going to do is go over module 7. For module 8, I was gonna say, I don't think there's any lectures because it's mostly watching documentaries. So this will be the last series of lectures for this course. We go ahead and start um, the Prezi, share my screen. All right, so we are going to talk about family and addiction. So I'm going to go ahead and give you that warning now because in the family section, we do talk about the violence that can happen within families, including sexual violence, including incest, including interpersonal violence, dating violence, um, anything that can happen in those close interpersonal relationships. And then in addiction, we're going to talk about addiction. So that comes with a series of um, situations that can be incredibly harmful. And so I just kind of wanted to give everybody a heads up because these are topics that can hit close to home. Um, I know that there's not a person I know at this point, I don't think, that doesn't know somebody or have somebody in their life or wasn't at some point or is an addict. Um, and that particular series of how that impacts knowing someone or having lost someone can be really, really hard and can be this mix of emotions for both the person that um, uses the drugs and the person who knows those individuals. So um, take care of yourself as always while we go over a series, the last series of really um, lectures that have to do with social problems. And then next module, you'll be hit with a series of documentaries that you get to choose from. So you can choose your topic accordingly. And some of those have to do with some social movements so that we can kind of be a little more uplifted as we end this course and talk about um, the social movements and things that actually are working towards change for these items that we have talked about all semester long. All right, so let me get into chapter 4. We're going to get into addiction first. We're going to talk about the theory, then we're going to talk about addiction. When we get into the actual who and what, we're going to talk about the drugs themselves. We're going to talk about primarily who's impacted by those. And we're going to talk about what happens to those individuals or what are the physiological and social implications of having an addiction to that substance. And we'll get into a wide variety of substances. There are addictions that are not substances, that are things such as food, such as sex, such as technology. There are a wide variety of things you can be addicted to that are outside of substances. And I'll talk about those a little bit, but not as much. Gambling is another one. And so we'll kind of touch base on those a little bit towards the end of that lecture. And then we're going to talk about just social policy in the future. Like, what are we doing now about addiction? What do we foresee changing in the future? What are some limitations to how we handle or interact with policies for addiction currently? And we'll kind of get into some of that. All right, so let's go ahead and start with theory. And then I'm actually going to switch to social policy in future and do a separate lecture for the actual who and what, because that one's going to, I think it'll be better to break those two things up. So, all right. So when we get into the theory of about any kind of addiction, the main core thing about a social problem is that society itself and a bunch of people have to see it as an issue within society and not a personal issue. So we live in a pro drug society. And by that, I don't mean like, hey, we're all about people having addictions to illegal substances. What we mean by a pro drug society is that we tend to prescribe medications for any personal problem or personal affliction that we can. So things that could be possibly handled in a separate way, um, we tend to prescribe a pill for that. There's a pill for that. You know what I mean? Like if you have ever watched TV um, in late nights or anything that has commercials, you're going to see commercials for medications. Talk to your doctor so you can be on this medication. And that's not necessarily bad, right? Some of those things have created a lot more stability and a lot more quality of life for a lot of people. But part of that being is that there's also a flip side to where that has created certain situations of dependency. For example, the opioid crisis, especially here in Kentucky and surrounding areas, stemmed from this idea that when a lot of war vets, a lot of um, people who had worked in mining, a lot of people who were experiencing chronic pain due to afflictions from their jobs, afflictions from um, specific kinds of injuries that are not easily fixed, say back injuries or things of like pains from any kind of um, amputation, things of that nature. And so they created when we came up with opioids and medications that could do a lot of good for chronic pain or directly following any kind of really extensive surgery. This was really good, right? This was something that was very much pushed. They had conferences surrounding what this was going to do for modern medicine. Um, these medications are still used almost exclusively nationally post surgery and post op, depending on if you ask not to have them. Um, and but the problem here was that doctors got so used to prescribing this particular kind of medication for any kind of chronic pain or any kind of thing that the actual source of the pain didn't necessarily get remedied. And instead, when people would stop getting prescriptions for this medication or would start to feel some pain or would get addicted to that feeling or that little bit of a high that it gave you, that little bit of euphoria that got them out of whatever that pain was, that they would want more and more and more. And so what ended up happening is we ended up having this problem with this opioids. And then when we started seeing this be a problem, the social policy was okay, well, we stopped prescribing opiates to a wide variety of people. And that caused these individuals who had been getting these prescriptions very easily to have long term uh, drug addiction problems that then would have to turn to some other kind of form of drugs, usually heroin, um, to get that same euphoria, to get that same pain remedies, to get that certain level of comfort that they had found in those opioids. And the problems here are all multifaceted because companies and doctors were pushing these medications um, on top of people with chronic pain were lacking non-narcotic options, along with the sources of those chronic pains not being met, along with the level of massive amounts of social factors, including economic instability, including lack of very good health coverage, including a whole host of problems, created kind of this whirlwind impact that really has still got a grip on a good portion of this side of the country and specific areas um, in the West as well. And so this is just an example of how that pro drug, that find an answer, find a solution to this, has impacted addiction of a certain substance that then translates into addiction of other substances and translates into a societal issue, right? Um, the problem here is that depending on what it is, depending on the drug, its prevalence, and who are using it, will kind of depend on how and the way society views it. So, and we'll kind of get into this in another slide, but talking about the difference between that crack cocaine and cocaine as a um, legislative thing, or as something that is who and what gets prosecuted for drug offenses, or for distributing, or for um, using, or any of that particular thing, really depended on social factors, mostly race. Um, and there was a distinction there that wasn't necessarily necessary, because the two things um, impact the body, impact the person in incredibly similar ways. Um, but one was driven by the media to be this really heinous, horrible thing, and the other one was kind of not talked about as much, kind of pushed under the rug, because it was predominantly used by middle and upper class white men, um, and that when it was really in its height. Um, and so for those cases, it was more of a personal problem, right? It was something that when it interferes with somebody's own health or functioning, like that family dealt with it, that entity person, that person dealt with it, the company surrounding or what have you dealt with it. That was something that was more of a personal affliction. It was something that um, was impacted. It impacted the person's life, but it was like always the but after, right? It was, but it's not something society needed to deal with on a large scale, versus these social problems where many people disapproved of the drug and wanted something done about it. And that really was geared towards that more crack cocaine, because it was associated with and talked about in the media as being in this racial way of saying, well, this drug does this to this particular group, and then it makes them violent, and then look what's happening, the crime, right? Now, on the flip side, both of these drugs ended up being, to an extent, a social problem. However, because of the difference of who was being focused on as the user, they ended up getting very different attentions, and they very much ended up getting very different resources, very different um, help for those who were afflicted by this, and caused quite a bit of social unrest and injustice within the Justice Department on how they handled these two things. All right. And again, just a reminder, a social problem is when many people approve. Um, oh, there's also social problems when many people approve of a drug, but the social policy doesn't reflect that. And we're seeing a lot of that um, when it comes to marijuana in this country, right? There's an overwhelming support at this point to make marijuana legal federally. However, due to some key states and some key state legislation, there is a lot that, sorry, a lot that is trying to take away kind of that ability to do that. And a lot of that doesn't come down to the drug itself. It comes down to the fact that um, companies make money when you can isolate who and where you can grow it, who and where you can distribute it. And so that limits to a specific subset of people of companies that can make the product. And so, and why not keep that limited? Because then, as these states, one by one or what have you, start to get into it, I have already got this main business, I've already got this established, and I can start distribution areas in wherever it was that did this. Now, if we did it on a federal level, then there's a much more likelihood that I will have, as a business owner, a much higher um, competition rate. And so, just a reminder, it's not always just a social problem when people disapprove. It can also be a social problem when people are really approving of that drug and want social policy to kind of reflect that. All right. Let's get into symbolic interactionists. And so, he talked about in the book the temperance movement, or the struggle of power between um, really prominent Christians and immigrants from Italy, Germany, and Ireland. And really, that came down to these Christian groups really promoted this abstinence from any kind of use of alcohol, and which is, ironic given that they had that in their um, ceremonies, but that particular thing was given kind of this difference of societal opinion of what that was, because that was a holy ritual, because that was something that was at that point not considered alcohol. So there is some interesting thing there. And because alcoholism was something that was in society much a social issue, and has been for an exceptional period of time, um, there there's an interesting line that happened post prohibition, and probably the 1980s, we'll go 80s, 70s, 80s, where some Catholic churches and some other Christian churches would offer grape juice for those who struggled with alcoholism instead of that. So they acknowledged that that substance had, to some degree, a an addictive property, yet um, they still, post confirmation or post whatever adulthood ritual that they had in that was far less than age of 21, um, those within the church could still do the communion based drinking of that substance, which is interesting, right? Because that's who were really pushing for this abstinence movement, because those from Italy and Germany and Ireland had a much more cultural connection to wine, to um, other alcoholic substances, right? And so drinking came to symbolize this unreliability and lack of morals. And that was due to the fact that really the powers that be wanted those immigrants to be seen in that way, and to be connected to those um, particular ideologies, because that allowed them that particular social power and that ability to kind of keep it, right? Because they're assigning these other groups as this um, unreliable, and also kind of lazy, or kind of less desirable for hiring, less desirable for integrating into our social systems. Um, and that created this what's the word I'm looking for? This policy making that made alcohol illegal in the United States for a decent period of time. Now, then came the prohibition, and there was a lot of there was a lot of work to um, make sure that drinking was done in a way that was considered socially acceptable. And so, post this particular social policy um, where they wanted to make alcohol back legal, it is interesting because they did so with these various measures on it, right? So you have to be 21. You have to be um, you have to like there was more to it. It was also like you had to have valid um license or valid proof that you were a citizen of the country in order to order it. Um, I just said to be a little bit different than that. And that was really getting back at making sure that specific groups have access to this and specific groups did not in very particular ways. Um, I will also say that there's also still a push in this country to make alcohol legal for those 18 and up. And that's due to other countries being able to, due to the fact that that is also our age for military. And so, because these military get to travel into a wide variety of countries, that it is legal. Um, there is a wide push for if you can die for your country and fight for your country, that you should also be able to um, make the personal decisions that come with drinking or not drinking. Um, and there's significant, again, push against that, right? So it kind of depends on where you're at. There are also still a wide number of dry counties within certain states. Um, I experienced that for the first time when I moved to Arkansas for a little while. Um, I had never actually lived or knew really that dry counties existed. There's also a lot of places that have limitations on when you can sell it. Say you can't sell it on Sundays, or you can't sell it past whatever time in the evening, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I'm from Kentucky, right? Which does have some dry counties too, by the way. But we have drive-through liquor stores. So the mind-boggling idea of a dry county just was a social, difference for me. It was something that I really had to think about. Well, why would this particular group do this and have social policies in this way? And why would um, the place that I was from and the place that I knew have rules and um, a different understanding of that, right? So there is still a wide variety of opinions when it comes to alcohol and its social policies within the United States. Some can be said that we're going through that same particular element with marijuana at our current historical moments, right? And that's just to say that uh, marijuana was not illegal in the United States until really, um, I can't remember exactly when it became illegal. I used to know this. But for a wide variety of time until there was a element that um, correlated with a certain levels of judicial injustice, which came again about race and who was using marijuana and how they could use that particularly against a certain group in order to maintain power and control. Um, there wasn't legal ramifications for having or using marijuana. And that is something that, as a country, we're having very wide conversations about how the use of marijuana is fairly widespread and fairly equal when it comes to racial demographics on who is using this, right? So, like, it is pretty equal across the board. However, primarily it is uh, Black men and Latino men that are um, getting charged with marijuana charges for the usage um, or for distributing, right? It is also interesting that that is also the number one drug for white people to be arrested or to be used against those individuals, um, despite the fact that proportionally per use, it actually is Black individuals who are arrested and or tried and or sentenced um, and sentenced more harshly for that particular substance. However, it will be interesting to see how long it takes for the federal government to or if it will, or if it'll roll back some of the state guidelines that are already out on marijuana. But there seems to be a general consensus that at a federal level, there is overwhelming support in this country for making marijuana legal. Now, again, that'll probably come with age restrictions and restrictions on who has it, and there's likely to be some kind of medical usage or medical marijuana federally prior to that, or we may end up having very much this slow ramping of states getting those medical marijuana bills passed and then ending up having a widespread federal marijuana usage um, as a substance that is just legal recreationally and medically. All right. We also are going to talk about the language surrounding addiction when we talk about that Jones article. So I'm not going to get into it as much here, but that language does fall under symbolic interactionism because how we talk about this subject matters and how we talk about the people who use drugs matter, right? All right. So functionalism. So prescription and illegal drugs serve functions, right? They treat ailments and they lessen tension for the user, and they provide income for growers, distributors, and sellers. I would argue that there are probably a couple more positive functions, including like social interaction, right? We use particular substances, especially alcohol, especially marijuana, even some of the other drugs in social settings to be part of a group or to be taking to take in part of a particular experience. There's also been studies to show that if your boss, say, smokes or what have you, or drinks, that if you do those things as an employee with your boss, you're more likely to be given promotions. You're more likely to be thought of when they're looking for people to fill other roles or to gain, say, maybe a raise or what have you. And that's because within those social settings, you're allowed that social network in more ways that a person who maybe didn't smoke and wasn't going to be out there for those 15-minute breaks every so often with that person may not have, right? You're going to put your face next to that boss's face and they're going to know you because these are the social interactions that you were doing together, right? Uses of drugs can also obviously produce some dysfunction, right? Abuse and dependency and addiction related crimes. You have the negative side effects and health problems related to both prescription and illegal drugs. You have the cost of the medications themselves and what that means in terms of being able to access them versus maybe accessing something like, and again, you could go back to the opioid crisis in this, right? The cost effectiveness when you don't have insurance of gaining your medication versus maybe going and being able to gain heroin, depending on where you are in the socioeconomic hierarchy. And so there's also self-medication with these alternative or illegal drugs due to a wide variety of ailments, both physical, emotional, mental, and that self-medication can even be something as simple as using alcohol as a substance to kind of coat or lessen the impacts of trauma that you've experienced or something of that nature. And then again, you have the illegal drug markets that have a wide variety of criminal methods, including things of carrying or people carrying within their own actual bodies that can have really bad implications to one of those items first, or should one of those things, or just having the legal implications of being caught as part of any kind of the drug market process. I would also say that those drug markets, depending on where they're at globally, also take advantage of, use, or politically politically and violently take over particular areas. So think of the drug cartels in the North American South and the South American markets. You can think about certain plants and where they're grown and who is the one doing the actual labor. So there's a lot of child labor issues when it comes to that, or just who's distributing it, right? Who is actually being the ones who are carrying those medications across borders, or who are carrying them across state lines, or who are um, who they're selling to, right? All of these things are going to have really different functions when it comes to society, right? All right, and then we're going to get into conflict theory and feminist theory. They're kind of connected when it comes to this. And they're connected when it comes to a wide variety of topics, but especially when we talk about family, we're going to talk about and violence within a family. We're going to talk a lot about feminist perspective because they're the leading theorist when it comes to anything that has to do with violence within an interpersonal setting, and the resources and or policies that we can make and or do to create less violent societies. All right, so drug laws can be used as political tools, right? We talked about this a little bit when I was talking about the cocaine versus crack cocaine. And that's just an unleash of police against a particular group. In most cases, it is racially drawn, and that aroused sentiments against disfavored groups. U.S. blaming narcotics trade on different countries. That's another example, right? So saying that all immigrants from any kind of Latin America or Mexico are drug dealers really has a negative impact for this group, as they may be fleeing that exact problem, right? They may be fleeing drug cartels. They may be actually trying to get away from these particular violent entities. And so then labeling them as these particular groups is really homogenizing, and also it is deliberate in its intention to make individuals think that these particular immigrants are unwanted and are problematic, so that these particular groups are not melded into society in a positive way. Now, that's not to say that everybody falls for this. That's not to say that everybody thinks that, but that being the overdriving message, similar to the way in which Black men were portrayed as and continue to be portrayed as violent criminals, alienates them from the ability to garner certain kinds of respects, garner certain kinds of jobs, garner certain kind of economic stability. And it can really be an uphill battle in this country for individuals with any kind of connection to these countries that have been part of any kind of narcotics or any other drug trade within this country. So when it comes to medicine, again, you're going to have cost, you're going to have access, and those create a lot and a wide variety of conflicts between particular social groups, and or between the ability to just access medical health care. And then again, you have for-profit systems that are navigating this, including the medicalization of human problems, right? So you're going to have the medical industrial complex, that is who gets to prescribe what they're prescribing and why. And so companies like we've talked a lot about Pfizer, a lot about Moderna, due to the vaccines related to this last pandemic. But those companies also prescribe a wide variety of other medications, and having their names so widely known, right, is beneficial to them. It's beneficial to them in the way of selling some of those other medications and or lessening the sting of having sold maybe opioids or what have you, that created a more large scale issue. Um, you also have things like ADHD and Ritalin, right? So, like, Ritalin was a drug that was used a lot in the 90s and early 2000s as a treatment for ADHD. It still is to a much lesser degree. Um, the problem here was that it didn't come with any kind of coping strategies, and it wasn't always effective, right? Um, as someone with a kid that has ADHD, um, the uppers were not something we, and the stimulants were not something we wanted to go down that route because, you know, having lived through the 90s and the early 2000s, I saw the kind of impact it would have on the person to be taking that Ritalin and that particular substance. You're also going to see a lot of those uppers get used on college campuses as a way to get through particular periods of time, right? Or even just to keep burning the candle at both hours and having that social life, but also trying to be alert for classes or to have some kind of time and energy for academic success. And so, excuse me, you have a lot of that um, crossing over into how are these substances being used and are they being used in a way that's actually effective, like in the case of ADHD. Again, you have abusing prescription medications. This happens more often than you think, and um, it depends on the person and who's doing it and what social class they have and what social expectations they have as to how much of a problem society views it as. So there's a lot of, not a lot, but there's a good amount of abusing prescriptions within the, say, upper middle class and upper class when it comes to socioeconomic status, um, especially when it comes to, say, anti-anxiety meds, antidepressant meds. And these things keep, they're not as much thought of as a addiction, and that's due to the people who are using. It's due to the ways in which they have been articulated within society, and that's something that is really interesting, but also problematic because it's taking a very gendered, a very um, racial look at our systems and what we think is problems, who we think are problems, and who's sending the messaging out to create that dynamic. And we've talked a lot about the opioid crisis, so I'm not going to get into it as much here. All right, let's get out of here and we'll go to the social policy in the future, and then I'll come back to the other lecture. So let's go to here. All right, so for the majority of the time, the US has had a get tough approach, or this time where the middle class really calls for much tougher laws. I would include the white middle class calls for much tougher laws, and that leads to the expansion of black markets and black market goods, and it also has led to the expansion of um, particular dysfunctions within criminalizing drugs. So you're bankrolling organized crime, the increase in street crimes and theft that are related to drug use, and the premature deaths of street drug overdoses. I would also add on there the latent dysfunction of the judicial system, particularly charging and then convicting and then using longer sentencing of those along racial lines. So those that are people of color are going to generally get charged more often. They're going to get higher rates of sentencing, and the sentencing is going to be harsher. And that's due to a wide variety of biases within our judicial system. Deciding social policy, right? So there's a lot of different social policies that have also been out there, such as like banning advertisement for certain things, including prescription drugs, treating the reasons for the drug use, is something that can be effective, possibly even more effective than the current prevention strategies. You have drug education, especially in youth. I know that DARE was really, really big. I don't know if it still is. When I was young, I'm not so sure it has the best impact. However, it is something that at least makes people aware, starts conversations. And then drug addiction, you have things like methadone maintenance, you have Alcoholics Anonymous, you have Narcotics Anonymous, you have all sorts of different anonymous groups that allow people to process any kind of addiction. You even have Gambling Anonymous. Um, and then medical treatments, finding different medical solutions to some of the problems that are there. I would also argue probably the biggest and most important social policy that you could do is creating inequality between creating equality between social groups, including socioeconomic status and stability, because those things are going to create um, alternative options for people who are struggling, right? They're going to feel connected to society. They're going to feel like they have resources. They're going to feel like they can draw on social networks to really help in those particular settings. And then down here, drug-free community, these are a wide variety of institutions and the importance of these particular groups when it comes to um, policy surrounding drug addiction. And in the future, so social movements will continue to arise and debate the acceptability of certain drugs, and they'll push for things like, again, the wide scope, the between things of like legalizing marijuana, although and possibly letting reducing sentencing or letting go entirely of prior drug sentences for that particular substance, all the way to things like, hey, we're going to really crack down on this opioid crisis. So we're going to have much harsher sentencing or what have you for using this particular substance, right? Those social policies, again, are going to be, and the movements for them are going to be very different. They're going to be harnessed from a very different perspective. And so really thinking through which one of those, which camp you fall in and why. However, we've been taking a tough on crime or a tough on drug addiction for an extended period of time in our history, and it has not had the desirable effects that people are wanting, which again then pushes either for even more harsh crimes or it pushes for different kinds of societal resources and implications for substance use. So we're also seeing a resurgence of psychedelics for therapy. LSD is actually used in therapeutic settings to go through kind of certain trauma scenarios without possibly as much um, connection to it, I guess. You're also seeing a lot of use of really any of the hallucinogens, but also things like marijuana being assigned for anxiety, things of that nature. It's important to consider or to reconsider the us versus the mentality, right? Um, Individuals with addictions or addicts in general are still human, right? They're still people. They still love, they still lose, they still they still feel. And those things require a humanizing of that issue and humanizing again of those people so that they're not looked at in society as bad. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit when we, oh, probably a lot of it when we talk about the Jones article, but really getting into why that's being done and rehumanizing the issue so that we can talk about solutions in a way that promotes healing and promotes societal well-being as well as personal well-being for individuals who have really struggled with this topic, right? And then treating the cause of addictions, right? You have to get to the root of it, because there is, for whatever reason, whether that be medical ailments, whether that be um, social isolation, whether that be a wide variety of traumas, whether that be a wide variety of um, social implications. There are a ever growing list and number of things that push people in society to want to escape, to want to feel that pain less. And if the core root of that doesn't get treated, it's much harder for that person to cope with or continue to live free of substances. So, a reminder that, again, these individuals are human, and that if we can find social policies that treat them as such and get to the root of the issues, then you're much more likely to have success when it comes to eliminating needs or far lessening those within society. The future of drugs, you're always going to have ever changing recipes for particular drugs. You're going to have new drugs that come out. Um, Hoping things such as like bath salts or things that just make you absolutely lose your damn mind are not the next wave. However, we don't know, right? Um, as much as science is always looking for, or say even not even just science, but also like um, markets are always looking for the next best clothing item, right? So these markets are also looking for the next most addictive substance, the next best high, right? And that's intentional because there is a market for this. So the people selling this want to create a substance that keeps people coming back, whether it be because of the high that it achieves, whether or because of the notion of dependency. And these things are there intentionally to recirculate their markets, right? Because as much as we don't want to admit it, um, substances are also part of a drug market, right? They're part of an economic system. And our current economic system is capitalism, which essentially is money at all costs. And so this market runs on that exact motive as well. Um, and then you're going to see the culture and drug and how drugs play into that, right? You're going to see changes over time, like you did with marijuana. We may go the other direction. Maybe with alcohol, you may see like another drug being legalized or more drugs being legalized because they're seeing a positive impact on how those are being used and or less dependency. It just kind of depends, right? um Culture's never going to say the same about any topic um forever. And there's a reason for that, right? Whether it be progress, whether it be backwards, whether it be depending on how you view any given topic, um whether it be positive or negative, that comes with kind of time and research into how those changes are impacting that particular issue. And then again, a reminder that drugs are also used as a means of controlling populations, of controlling people within interpersonal relationships, such as domestic violence situations. It's also something that is used as a means of um, a requirement really to keep you coming back to the medical industrial complex. That is not to say that anyone that uses a prescription drug is being controlled, but it is to say that it is a reminder to all of us to kind of, why are we on this medication? What is it doing? Is it helping? Right. And to always question that, because otherwise you're going to get a medication for every possible thing that you might or might not need one for. All right. So I will go back and kind of get into the other subsets of this particular topic, and the actual substances themselves or addictions themselves in the next lecture. But for this one, we are going to go ahead and be done. I hope you have a wonderful week. And if you need anything, including resources for any kind of addiction, please don't hesitate to ask, or to see that resource guide that I gave you at the beginning of the semester that is in Blackboard, because that will also have plenty of resources if you do not want to reach out, but you still want to look them over, or you have someone in your life that may need them. Again, I'm here for any questions, comments, or concerns. Please don't hesitate to ask them.